Hello, and welcome back to the Argyle CIO Leadership Forum. My name is Nick with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. I have some important information to share with you, and then we will turn the floor over to our esteemed keynote speaker. First, a quick reminder to stop by our sponsors' virtual booths at any time during today's event and for the following week. To ask questions throughout the session, simply type into the Q&A chat and we will address your questions at the end of the session. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker, Nithin Ramachandran, Vice President, Information Technology, Enterprise Agility Transformation, PMO, Data Analytics, and AI, Kohler Company. We are excited to have Nithin for his keynote presentation titled Data Centricity, Building a Foundation for Enterprise Agility. Welcome, Nithin. Over to you.
Thanks, Nick. Appreciate that. Well, hello, everyone, and excited to be here and share some of my experiences. Let me give you a little bit of background. I won't talk too much, given the introduction that Nick has already provided. But suffice it to say, I play the role, like many of you in this conference, play the role as a Chief Data and Analytics Officer for Kohler Company. So essentially serve as a VP of data, AI, and transformation. Essentially been in the data space, playing multiple leadership roles in a variety of industries. I've been a published researcher, very, very passionate about the intersection of academia and industry. From an educational background, went to WashU, very proud WashU alum, and of course, I'm a chemical engineer by trade. Variety of hobbies, but most proud of being a father to a wonderful 4-year-old boy. So that's a little bit about me. So excited to be here. Of course, a lot of lessons learned through my career, and I'm hoping to share some of that with all of you guys. Of course, I have my LinkedIn handle over there in case you want to reach out later and network or ask questions. I'm more than happy to connect with more members of my peer group. Very good. With that, let's get started. I think the primary motivation, and this is kind of the world that we all live in, and this is one of the most powerful quotes in my data career that I've seen, which is that we're surrounded by data, but we've starved for insights. No matter which company we work in, we have access to so much of data, but at the end of the day, it's really about driving value with data. And unless you're in a company that absolutely doesn't deal with data, I'm sure that you're in a camp where you're facing one of these challenges, right? Either you're in a situation where you're a technology leader and you're providing data capabilities, and you reach out and you provide all of this to your counterparts, on the business side, and essentially what comes back is the data is not useful, it's not trustworthy, it's not what they're looking for, or it's misrepresenting reality, right? You either have a platform issue where it's difficult to serve the data that your counterparts across the business need, or on the other hand, you actually have a stable platform, you're actually able to provide the insights, but what you see as a result is a lack of skill set in the business to actually leverage the descriptive, predictive, and prescriptive insights or tools that you're providing to actually convert that to value, right? And for me, it's, I've experienced, both of these scenarios and sometimes both together, at various points in my career. But to me, it's essentially a part of this path to a data-centric enterprise, right? And it's a little bit of a utopia, right? And when we look at it where, if you're in a leadership role, the chief data officer's role being focused more on generating value in a data-centric enterprise, where data is embedded in every decision, interaction, and process, driving that value stream, where the data operating model treats data as a product rather than an ad hoc journey where you're just providing reports and serving requests. Instead, it is a product that you take care of with a product management mindset, where you have different members, where the data ecosystem is large enough that you have data curated, not in silos, but curated with adequate standards across the enterprise, and where you actually have a data ecosystem membership being a norm, where data is shared by different parties across the enterprise. And of course, where data management is mature enough, where you're focused on privacy, security, and resiliency. Now, this is, of course, the utopia. And if you have some skepticism in listening to that, where you've heard this dream man before, I wouldn't blame you, because I think that it is definitely a long journey to get to that kind of enterprise. But then it is a journey. And the question is, how do we manage that journey in our roles on behalf of our enterprises, right? So the way I've kind of grouped together this journey is essentially in 4 phases, and most companies fall into one phase or the other. Now, unless you are part of a newly formed company that's formed in the last maybe 5 to 8 years, you're probably skipping some of these phases and maybe you're in a much more mature state. But for most enterprises, that have been making this journey, it usually starts with data being an afterthought, where there's no cohesive strategy around the data. Usually your team is in a ticket come, ticket go kind of a scenario where they're getting requests, they're serving requests, in the form of reports and Excel sheets or in some way, shape or form, right? So there's no cohesive strategy on deriving value from the data. And this is usually where the journey starts, where, either from competitive pressure or from, a C-suite mandate, you essentially start this data journey. And, establishing data foundations, implementing modern technology, usually cloud migrations, new tools that are built, new capabilities that are provided from a technology perspective. And this is where you see a lot of technology metrics coming into play, like, the volume of data that's gathered, the reliability of the data pipelines, and so on and so forth. But even in this phase, while you have a lot of technology, you're still dealing with the old habits of the enterprise, where still the demand is for ad hoc services. The demand is more for data dumps rather than insights. From there, you kind of move to the next phase where you start working on the culture and you start working on upskilling of the users. And you're able to start to put together a platform product operating model where you have a platform that is more technology focused, and you have products or product teams that are focused on different areas of the business, where they're working hand in hand with business counterparts and driving value. And finally, of course, once you get past the culture norms, when people start waking up to using data effectively for decision-making, for business processes, for value generation, it automatically starts to lead to data being a monetizable asset, where data stream is seen as a profit and loss center or a value driver. And you start to now see outcome-oriented investments happening in data. And this is a phase, and we might also operate in larger companies where there might be different parts of the company that exist in different phases. But our job as leaders of the data functions is essentially to make sure that we're able to navigate and we're able to champion the company through this journey towards being a data-centric enterprise. So that's easier said than done. And usually this journey is pretty long. It is, especially the culture changing part, the upskilling part can be pretty daunting, right? And in many situation, we actually have to be able to move through these frameworks, learn lessons, and essentially make sure that we have a repeatable framework in place where we can guide various initiatives through this journey. Now, more often than not, many a time where I've seen the failure of this journey failing is usually when you try to do it, at too large a scale, because culture change and change management is extremely difficult to do at that scale. So you have to pick your battles. So usually what happens is you pick an area, you mature the area, you move on to the next one and move on to the next one. So when you do that, what you need is a repeatable framework. And that's really what I want to share with all of you today. I'm going to share 4 frameworks which will allow us to make sure that we're speaking the language of value when we think through our strategies. We are creating the reliability that our business needs to demand. We're leading the culture change as chief data officers versus demanding a culture change. And of course, we're treating data as a product. So 4 frameworks, and I love mnemonics because it really helps me remember, and it also helps me communicate effectively to my teams. In most team meetings, usually, the rewarding moment for me is when I see my management team and they start quoting these frameworks where they're saying, yep, we've achieved rest, or we have dared our outcome, or we've been leading our culture. These mnemonics really help through. So what I'll do is walk through each of these frameworks. The first framework is DARE, which really focuses on value orientation. The second framework is REST, where you're focusing on the reliability of your data platform and data products. The third framework is LEAD, which is more focused around building a learning and upskilling culture within your organization. And finally, of course, I borrowed the fourth framework because this was a great one from Google. The first three was generally generated from my experience, but the fourth one, there was no need to change this framework from Google on digital products. It's just making that applicable to data products is the HEART framework. So dare your outcomes, rest your platforms, lead your culture, and give your products a heart. So let's jump in straight into these frameworks. And of course, keep the questions coming if there's questions as I kind of explain some of these frameworks. So one of the first things that I do, now, usually most leaders have gone through this 90-day framework. When you take on a new role or take on a new job, you spend the first 90 days understanding the landscape that you're working in. So for me as a data leader, one of the first things that I usually do is ask for the financials of the company that I'm working with. And this used to be the same when I was in consulting, pretty much the same when I take a new role or a new assignment these days. And the reason I ask for that is a value orientation. Now, there's pretty much only 4 ways, at least this covers, I'm still to come across a case which I cannot fit to this framework. There's generally 4 drivers of value, 4 ways in which you can work on value when it comes to data initiatives. And the big part of the question is, can you articulate that value clearly? So it's either better decisions that are made in the company. It is actions that you can, you can drive a customer towards or an employee towards. It's a risk that you can mitigate, or it is some sort of efficiency that you can create. Now, why do we actually have this framework? Let me give you an example, right? So for example, imagine that you're in a marketing scenario where you're building, it's a common use case to use recommendation engines, as a means to improving customer lifetime value. Now, this is something that can be, this is more of a generic metric, the customer lifetime value, because it's hard to measure and prove value in a short-term orientation. So really where we focus on is saying it's an action. We want the customer to click on the recommendation engine, and we want to entice them towards a purchase. In the same way, by articulating these very clearly, by spotting a decision, an action, a risk we can mitigate, or efficiency that we can go after, it really allows us to pinpoint, to speak to a value statement and it also is a way for us to speak the language of the business. Remember, you can't go after everything at one point in time. You have to pick your battles as a data leader, because again, the biggest change that you have is not the technology, it is actually the culture change, right? So you got to pick a value statement that is meaty enough that you're going to get the support and you're going to be able to garner the investments for it. So I see that there's a question over here about timing and for prioritization of data investments, right? And to me, it's a variety of different factors. You really have to look at it in terms of, as you scan the different opportunities that are available, as a data leader, you've got to take a step. You've got to take an assessment of, first, are you able to articulate the value? Are you able to articulate the value of the DARE framework? Are you able to have a clear measurement of that value? And the third part is there an organizational interest? And many a time, this is something that I've leveraged in my career, is to really see where the executive conversations are going around. For example, nowadays, supply chain can be a key area of focus for many companies because of all the supply chain stacks. So use cases like demand forecasting, demand planning tend to be highly sought after. Whereas if we were to look at maybe 5 years back, digital and customer 360 applications would have been the norm of the day. So you have to really look at where the wind is blowing and also where you can clearly articulate value. So that's the DARE framework, which is usually the first step before even you start anything, right? Now, once you have the DARE framework in place, so this was the example I was talking about, where you can clearly articulate that you want a customer to buy via recommendation engine. It's an upsell, and there's an opportunity of about $1 million, 10 million, whatever the number may be. All right. The second part, now that you know your value statement, you know the domain of data that you are focused on, now you can start to actually focus on your technology. With the cloud footprint that we have, we can be extremely selective about the data that we bring in. We don't have to move mass systems over. We can essentially start moving selective amounts of data. But the question then is, the key point that actually generates adoption is the reliability of the data, the reliability of the environment. And of course, remember that in most use cases these days, you're dealing with large volumes of data. So you also need to keep cost considerations in your mind. So the REST framework is first about making sure that your data infrastructure is reliable, right? This is usually the test where you're looking at it. Is data of high quality? Are the pipelines fault tolerant? Have they been built efficiently? The second part of it is, especially as you're looking at a cloud environment, you look at your equation of saying, what's your cost structure? Are you really efficient from a time standpoint? Are you efficient from a cost standpoint? Scalability becomes really important because most companies these days, we all follow agile development, which means you might be starting with a very small use case that can quickly scale, right? For example, when I was working in a healthcare context, one of the platforms that we worked on had $3 billion worth of transactions happening. So we started with a very small set of customers, consumers or users on that platform, but we had to quickly scale to 3 billion transactions. So scalability becomes really important. And at the end of the day, you have to make sure that whatever you're putting into the platform, you're having a regular continuous testing framework. So that's your REST framework. So dare the outcomes. So look for decisions, look for your actions, look for risks, look for the efficiencies that you can generate. Once you have decided which use case you want to focus on, use the REST framework to create a measurement around the reliability of your platform and the platform health. So if we were to go back to our customer journey and product recommendation use cases, so first we talked about, we've finalized that we want to look at an action, we want the customer to perform an action. Now, in order to get that done, what is the reliability that we need to have? We need to make sure that we're focusing our attention on the relevant master data. So usually customer orders, in this case, even product data. So making sure that we have the right governance in place for that data. Again, we don't have to go for large volumes. We can keep it at smaller volumes that are relevant to that use case. We're making it efficient because we're using the cheapest form of infrastructure possible, which is essentially your data lake storage. Putting in a Delta Lake format allows you to move data real time. You keep it scalable by using APIs, and you're monitoring the entire solution, making sure that you're testing it on a regular basis with data observability tools. So you're starting to see how you get a value statement. Based on that value statement, you can now have the technical team focus on the technical aspects of making sure the platform is reliable. So I see a lot of questions coming through. I think some of them I'll probably take towards the end. Well, look, what is the most practical way an IT leader can assure that business objectives are based on the most relevant and recent data? I think the first part of it is we've got to take off our IT leader hats, right? To me, data is a unique beast where you cannot just stay on the IT side, because if you stay on the IT side, you don't understand the business relevance of the data. And the minute you stop understanding that, it becomes difficult to put a strategy in place. So for all of the data leaders, this is one of the things that I practiced throughout my career, is to not identify with being an IT leader, but identifying myself as being a techno-functional leader who actually operates between technology and the business. So you're taking an active interest in educating yourself on the business. The second part of it is a product management function. Putting your product managers in place who can develop those grassroots relationships in the business are going to be critical to making sure that your use cases are relevant and applicable to the business on a regular basis. All right, so we went through, so from a journey perspective, we have addressed the situation where we are looking at the right value equation. We have looked at the right reliability equation. So at this point, basically, if you have implemented these two frameworks, you've got the right value statement, so you're going after the right things. And now you have an equation where you also have a platform that is serving the right data to the end user, right? Now you have the user in the middle. If this is a decision science process, you have a user in the middle usually. Or even if this is an experiment that's being done, you still are dealing with marketing and CX teams who vary in their levels of data maturity. So this is now we start to get in the upskilling areas, right? So this is where we have got to lead the change. So for example, at Colo Company, we have put together a program called the Colo Capability Accelerator. So we have essentially we've partnered with Ivy League business schools to actually bring in applied education into our company. So as we look at, so the way I approach it is, for example, let's say that the biggest value that I see is the supply chain organization focused on demand planning. Let's say that's an area that I'm focused on. If that's the case, then I also focus the upskilling component to that specific area. Remember, it becomes really expensive if you try to do it at scale. So you have to make the value equation work for you. So that's really where you lead the change by focused attention on areas where your value statement is going to be realized, right? So the learning framework is pretty simple. First, we've got to learn and engage with the users, make sure that we understand the context that we work in, understand what education is relevant to them, and engage them with that education. So this is really where we do a lot of observations with our associates, or we call them associates or employees who work in the different target departments for us. And we try to understand, what does their work look like? What is the decision? What is the action? What is the risk? What is the efficiency that we are trying to optimize for? And how does that fit into their workflow? What role do they have to play? Depending upon that, we curate content for them and engage them with that content. And once we have that, we work with them to actually help them apply that content in an experimental pilot POC kind of format, and then allow them to demonstrate value at scale. Now, that's the important part, which is it's important for us that we technology teams, we cannot just take ownership of the entire value stream. We have to make sure that the scalability is addressed by our end users and decision makers. So that's a lead framework. So if we were to go back to that product recommendation use case, this is really where you would do design sessions with users, you would conduct training sessions to learn and engage with the marketing and the CX teams. You design a small experiment so that they can try it out, and you actually show them, you handhold them through that process of saying, here's how we do experiment design, here's how we apply the learning that we have had. And once that is done, and you're starting to get to a point where you've proven success of that experiment or POC, you're there to be on a consultative basis with them to help them scale and demonstrate the value. So that is the lead framework where you lead the culture. Usually you're going to need some partner. You usually need some partner, for example, like the Ivy League schools that we work with, to bring in and help with the learning framework. I see a question about how do you know these are the areas to target? And again, this is really where we have to network effectively. This is about positioning yourself more on the business side and less on the technology side. The technology part is more logical. It's more easier to address. The business side and the value equations are usually the harder ones. So this is really where you can target it if you can use the DARE framework to clearly articulate the value. You can measure that value and demonstrate that value. And third, through interactions, through communications with executive leaders, senior leaders, you know that you can easily go ahead. You know that they're interested in that value stream. It is something that is material to them. If those three checkboxes are met, you know that that's an area that you can target. The final framework is, now that you have the user in place, you have released the product, you are in a position where you're starting to measure the engagement with the product. Now your first release is done. You're now in a position where you're starting to look at the continuous feedback loop that's being generated. Now, how do you know that this feedback loop is working? This is the HEART framework. So this is actually Google's framework for digital products, right? The first part, of course, is you want to measure satisfaction, happiness and satisfaction. It's very simple. Do a 5-star survey, do some form of a survey where you're popping up a survey to the user. If you're looking at a traditional analytics user, send them a survey, or even do focus group sessions to measure the rate of satisfaction. What you want to see more, and this is really a metric that I care about, is the engagement. So when we look at engagement, what I want is, if we are releasing a product, even if it's a simple Power BI dashboard, we want users to be engaging with it, spending time with that. And aside from engagement, one of the things you want to know, and this is really where you know you're on the right track, is if the users are adopting the product pretty quickly. So this is where you want to see the adoption shoot up as soon as you're releasing a product, and you're seeing sustained utilization, you're seeing the retention happening on that product. So engagement is you're seeing people spend more time. Adoption is where you're seeing people ramp up pretty quickly. And retention is really where you're seeing continued usage. And finally, of course, really the value orientation. What are you trying to get that user to do? Are you getting them to perform a certain action? Are you trying to see if a decision can be made better, risk optimized better? So the task success piece is that value orientation. Going back to your DARE framework, the task success is a measurement of saying, is my DARE framework playing out? Am I getting the value that I looked at? So the HEART framework is something that you have product managers continually measure, continually monitor. And as soon as you see any deviation in these metrics, that's immediately a point for you to go back to the user and repeat the lead framework and figure out if changes need to be made. So we bring all of that together into kind of that customer journey product recommendation framework. You have customers, the action is customers buying. You put in, data quality and governance initiative for that volume specific piece of data. You're processing it efficiently. You've used microservices to deliver the data. You're monitoring that. And you've done your lead framework, design and training sessions with the users. You've devised a small experiment to show them how to apply it. And then you're supporting them in demonstrating the application at scale. And finally, you have your HEART framework. So where you're using 5-star surveys to measure the happiness, and you're using the clickstream data to measure your engagement, adoption, and retention. So again, clickstream data could be for a web use case. If you're using something like Power BI, you do have analytics on usage of every dashboard and workspace. So you can do that. There are ways, there are multiple data observability tools that are available today that you can use to measure the utilization of your data environments as well. So everything from a data table to an algorithm, of API service, anything can be measured these days. So it's really, really important to put those measurements in place upfront. So that's really the framework. Let me just go back to that framework slide just so I can kind of just close this up once more, which is, this is really the messaging that I have, and I've found tremendous amount of success. When I look at my leadership teams, I'm able to delegate much more effectively, focusing my attention on continually staying abreast with the business, but delegating the teams, allowing them to dare the outcomes, allowing them to let the platform rest, allowing them to lead the culture change, and of course, allowing them to develop products with heart, right? So that's essentially the framework. It is a repeatable framework. Find use case after use case. You can start utilizing this framework and go from there. All right, I see a couple of questions. Let me try to take it. So I see a question. Are the training sessions geared for customer-facing marketing team members? Not necessarily. You can do training for internal, like for example, our Colo Capability Accelerator program is focused on analysts and anybody who is in that decision loop or in that value stream loop. We essentially have them go through the training. I even have my product managers go through the training so they can all speak the same language. And then finally, does this encompass data fabrics? Of course, irrespective of how data is delivered, it encompasses all of that. So if data fabric is the product or platform or product that you're looking at, you can apply the same framework over there. It doesn't change because this is a very generic framework, not just for data. You can use it for pretty much any application, but it fits really well into the data-centric journey. That's kind of it from a content standpoint. I've tried to keep on time. If there are any other questions, I'm more than happy to take it.
Well, thanks so much, Nitin, for such an insightful presentation. That was great. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this fantastic keynote presentation. This session, along with all of today's content, will be available on demand following the event. Thanks so much.